So you want to know more about the story of the Latter-day Saints, the first scholarly attempt to produce an institutional history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that actually caused a massive backlash from LDS leaders in the 1970s. This year, 2026 marks the 50th anniversary of one of the most important books written in Mormon history, James Allen and Glenn Leonard's The Story of the Latter-day Saints. This is a second edition cover. This is what the first edition cover looked like. Not only is the contents of the book important, but its backstory, its reactions, and its legacies are also worth engaging. It's a history book that made history, in other words. It raises questions concerning institutional histories, devotional framing, and ecclesiastical censorship. And besides touching on topics that are perennially important for Mormonism, the book also fits within a broader context of disputes over writing American history in general, because it took place against the backdrop of America's bicentennial celebrations in 1976. So in this video, I hope to do a few things. One, talk about the backdrop for the book and its production. Two, talk about its reception, and then we'll dig into some of the lasting legacies and why this book and the story that surrounds it is almost as important as the history that you find within its covers. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has had an official church historian since it was founded in 1830 and 31, with John Whitmer becoming the first church historian, and since then there's almost been an unbroken line of other individuals chosen. Now, most of those historians were church officials. They did not have much background in history, and they were tasked to promote a faith-promoting story of the saints that fits devotional and correlated messages. Think about the revelation that Joseph Smith dictated on the day the faith was organized on April 6, 1830, that says, "There shall be a record kept among you, and that record shall testify that Joseph Smith is a prophet." So it is a very devotional and us versus them narrative. Perhaps the most influential individual to hold that position of church historian was Joseph Fielding Smith, who was the son of Joseph F. Smith, who was the nephew of Joseph, so part of the Smith family. Joseph Fielding Smith, who believed that he had this chosen blood flowing through his veins, was raised with this sense of the devotional construct and the us versus them nature of history. Some of his earliest memories were being sat on the knee of his father and hearing about how his grandfather, Hiram Smith, was killed in Carthage jail. So it makes sense why he would see such high stakes and partisan outlook for how you narrate the faith's past. So he was appointed the church historian in 1921. He was already an apostle. And a year later, he produced what came to be known as the institutional history for the church. It was titled Essentials in Church History, published in 1922. And it remained the official church-approved history book for a half-century. Smith himself would remain the church historian until 1970. That's a nearly 50-year tenure as the church's primary devotional history. Now, the themes of that book, and it's important to talk about essentials in church history, because it tells us a lot about how the LDS Church wanted to view its past. It focused on a theological aim. It is meant to tell a devotional story. It aims to show the hand of God in shaping the church. There are clear heroes versus clear villains, and there is almost prophetic perfection, if not prophetic direction of how God is leading the faith. However, this type of history conflicted with the rising new Mormon history of the era, where there were scholars from the LDS tradition who are digging into the faith's past and recognizing that the sources and the context do not fully meet this devotional context, which is how that story starts to be challenged in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s when you get these Latter-day Saints with a better understanding and academic credentials of how history actually operates outside of that devotional setting. Before I get too much further, a reminder that if you enjoy this type of geeking out about history, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I try to do deep dives on historical topics every Monday. I connect the past to the present, talking about politics and pop culture and movies and other things in the contemporary news on Wednesdays, and on Fridays, like with this video, I pull back the curtains on how historical work is done, either talking about important books like Story of the Latter-day Saints, or talking about recent books, interviewing authors, or even digging into a particular topic and looking into the sources behind the story. If you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for so many of you who have wanted to give back, you can become a member for the channel, which for a very low cost, you can help support what I and my wonderful producer Anthony do, and that also gives you early access to the videos. I also try to do live discussions the first Wednesday of every month, so look forward to those. And also looking forward to January 27th, Tuesday at 5 p.m. I will be doing some book signings at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City while I am in Utah for the Utah Historical Society's awards banquet. All right, all of that business out of the way, let's get back to the history of a history book. After a century and a half of Latter-day Saints having people serve as church historian without much historical background, that changes in 1972 when Leonard Arrington, this dude who had a background in academic history, he taught at Utah State University, was appointed church historian, the first individual with a PhD to hold that calling. It was part of a broader push for professionalization at the church headquarters. I should emphasize, though, that Leonard Arrington, even though he had this academic background, he was still devoted to the faith, and he wanted to blend what he called the devotional and the academic world, believing that the faith could withstand serious and rigorous historical scholarship. And he had a broad agenda for what came to be known as the Camelot years, which historians often think back to these great years of the 1970s, when Leonard Arrington was in charge of the history division at the church headquarters. He wanted to broaden archival access. He wanted to publish a series of primary source documents, what they called the Heritage Series. They had a broad sesquicentennial 16-volume history series, which I talked about in a previous video. And he also envisioned two one-volume histories of the faith, one that would be focused to a non-Mormon audience, and one that would be focused to the Latter-day Saint audience. That latter volume was going to be written by James Allen and Glenn Leonard. Now, James Allen, who you see in this image, he is the guy on the left. Leonard Arrington is in the center, and Davis Bitton is on the right. Leonard Arrington was a church historian, and Allen and Bitton were the assistant church historians. And also, just marvel at this wonderful 1970s sartorial style captured in this image. James Allen was a professor at BYU, a wonderful historian, and as his co-author for this one-volume history was going to be Glenn Leonard, who also worked in the church history division and would later work for the church museum. Here you see a portrait of him from when he was one of the co-authors of the Massacre at Mountain Meadows volume decades later. The goal for this new one-volume history aimed at Latter-day Saints was to replace Joseph Fielding Smith's Essentials in Church History. And they did a really good job with it. They had excellent access to the archives. They drew from their backgrounds in social history. And they also built on this new Mormon history wave of modern scholarship, while still, in their minds, offering a faithful interpretation that was not a threat to Latter-day Saint truth claims. I'll also note that this was one of the first academic books that really analyzed 20th century Mormon history. It trailblazed understanding the modern LDS church past the renunciation of polygamy, while still remaining sensitive to LDS priorities and LDS topics. The book was published in 1976. Again, the goal was to replace Joseph Fielding Smith's Essentials in Church History, which had been the official institutional church history since 1922. However, it hit some snags. Because 1976 was a big year in how Americans understood their past. It was the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of America's founding, something that should ring a bell now because in 2026, Americans and those in the United States are commemorating the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary. And how the people in the United States celebrated that bicentennial demonstrated the growing partisan discord. You had the conservative politicians who wanted to celebrate the greatness of the United States, and you had liberal academics trying to wrestle with the complexities of the United States. Richard Nixon, of course, the president in the early 1970s before being forced to resign, he denounced academic historians for being too negative and downplaying the greatness of America, a theme that might sound quite familiar to you in modern debates over looking at America's past. And this actually resulted in competing bicentennial commissions, with some people celebrating the bicentennial some way and others the other way. And this creeps into how people talk about history in their books, including religious histories. And you had evangelicals like Peter Marshall and David Manuel in their book, The Light and the Glory, published during the 1970s, which dismissed academic scholarship in favor of spiritual hagiography and became a national bestseller. This book, as well as plenty of others, drew from Nixon and the American rights grievance politics and added a sense of spiritual mission and divine purpose, with the goal to see God's hand in shaping history. This anxiety seeps into the Mormon world. I could talk about a number of LDS leaders who drew from this rhetoric, but I'll focus in this video on Ezra Taft Benson and Boyd K. Packer, two apostles who adopted this anti-academic rhetoric and dismissal of secular history. Ezra Taft Benson delivered a talk at BYU for the bicentennial titled God's Hand in Our Nation's History. And let me give you a taste of what his speech sounded like. Secular scholarship, though useful, provides an incomplete and sometimes inaccurate view of our history. The real story of America is one which shows the hand of God in our nation's beginning. So you should see how circumstances were setting up a showdown between the type of history represented in Story of the Latter-day Saints, the one-volume history written by James Allen and Glenn Leonard, and this type of more devotional history that is adopted not just by Richard Nixon and the American right, but LDS apostles like Ezra Taft Benson. And Arrington recognized this was coming. This is what he wrote in his diary in December of 1975 after discussing the forthcoming Story of the Latter-day Saints, as well as several other histories they were hoping to publish. Quote, "If all of the works referred to above are published during the coming year, we shall undergo a real test. This is the hour of testing, of judgment, of being weighed in the balance. If we survive this year, we shall have proved, as I believe we can, that church history can be excitingly written and still be basically faith-promoting, and at the same time professionally and intellectually respectable. Sadly, things do not go as he planned." Story of the Latter-day Saints is published in the summer of 1976, and within weeks, Leonard Arrington, remember the church historian who's overseeing these projects, learned that several members of the Quorum of the 12 did not like the book, and they objected to what was described to him as, quote, "the absence of inspiration, descriptions of occurrences in church history without attributing their cause to God or to his discretion or direction and inspiration." In fact, Arrington was told that the Quorum of the 12 would be discussing Story of the Latter-day Saints at their next meeting, and Arrington feared that they would, from that point on, not just be criticized for the book, but be forced to go through church curriculum from that point on. Soon, Arrington learned that Ezra Benson had commissioned one of his assistants, who had been a church educator, to draft a detailed critique of the book, which was 8 single-spaced pages, critiquing Story of the Latter-day Saints for not bringing God into the picture and mentioning bad stories and being, quote, basically a secular history. Benson therefore recommended to the First Presidency that they remove the book, Story of the Latter-day Saints, from circulation and republish Joseph Fielding Smith's Essentials in Church History, which more accurately fit, in Benson's mind, the church's mission or view of how history should be written. Arrington wrote that, quote, "It is clear that President Benson will not stand for our real history, and since he is next in line and president of the 12, we We are in a powerless position, and no one wishes to consider our own rationale. Arrington even considered resigning at that point. Instead, he fought on. And then they had a very consequential meeting that took place on September 21st in the morning at the church headquarters in Salt Lake City. The meeting included Spencer W. Kimball and the First Presidency, as well as the apostles Benson, Mark Peterson, Howard Hunter, and Bruce McConkie. Bruce McConkie and Howard Hunter were the apostles assigned to work with the History Division, who were actually quite supportive, which might surprise some of you who are aware of Bruce R. McConkie. That meeting lasted several hours. Remarkably, in the meeting, Benson confessed that he had not even read the book yet, that he was just relying on critiques that had been provided to him, which probably doesn't surprise you knowing how, some of these types of people operate. But that did not keep him from laying out what he felt were the major problems with Story of the Latter-day Saints, that it was too secular. And he gave the example of the natural origins of the word of wisdom being based in the temperance movement rather than in just God declaring to Joseph Smith what they should do with their health. Benson objected to the focus on communalism in early Mormonism, which should not be a surprise given Benson's anti-communism. Benson argued that the book made Joseph Smith look bad, by which he probably just meant that it made Joseph Smith look human. He argued that reading the book would cause some Latter-day Saints to lose their faith because it would challenge their traditional narratives. By the way, Boyd K. Packer also summarized his critiques of the book by saying it's basically an apology, which rings quite familiar to today's debates over history, which just says that these academics are trying to make us feel bad about our history. In other words, it's an apology. Now, Arrington pushed back at this meeting, and this meeting that lasts several hours, at one point got to be a shouting match between Arrington and Benson and Peterson. For the moment, Spencer W. Kimball, who was the president of the church at the time, backed Leonard Arrington. He told him that this had been a productive meeting, and don't worry, the world isn't falling apart yet. But Arrington recognized that the writing was on the wall. He tried to curtail the damage as much as he could. He didn't even tell James Allen and Glenn Leonard that their book had prompted such a backlash. He kept the Apostolic Review quiet, and he kept from his employees the fact that all of their work was going to have to go through an Apostolic Review from that point on. But very soon it was clear that their freedom was being restricted. Remember, I mentioned that the Story of the Latter-day Saints was just going to be one of several major products that the Church History Division was going to provide. Very few of them saw fruition. In fact, the big 16-volume sesquicentennial history was scrapped. You can listen to that big story at a previous video that I did. And the History Division started losing its budget, they started losing their personnel, and eventually within a decade, the entire History Division was closed and Arrington was moved down to BYU. So what happened to Story of the Latter-day Saints? Well, it sold through nearly all of its 35,000 copies that were part of the first printing, and then it did not get a second printing immediately. In fact, the church's own magazines and newspaper were told that they could not cover the book nor draw from its contents. And the authors, James Allen and Glenn Leonard, were told, or they weren't told, they were just placed on a blacklist. They're punished due to their production of the book. So while Story of the Latter-day Saints was one of the crowning achievements of Arrington's Camelot, and such a massive glow up, to use the kids' terms, from Joseph Fielding Smith's Essential in Church History, it also marked the downfall of Arrington's Camelot years. So let's close by talking about some of the lasting legacies. After a decade, when the dust finally settled, the book was given a second edition in the mid-1980s, and then finally allowed to have, it was given a second printing in the 1980s, and then was given a second edition in the 1990s. That's what this volume comes from. It remains a phenomenal work of Mormon history, albeit a devotional one. I still believe it's one of the best social histories of the church ever written, and was a trailblazer in talking about the 20th century institution. I kept this book at arm's length while I was writing my one-volume history, American Zion. The volume is also should be seen as a precursor to the more recent Saints series that the Church History Department of Salt Lake City recently produced, the 4-volume history of the LDS Church. I may dig into that history series at some point in the future, so let me know if you have any questions, because it's very different in tone and approach and style than the Allen and Leonard volume. And the LDS Church did become much more open in the ensuing decades. But those core tensions remain. The balance of faith and history that has always been a core tension of the LDS tradition, especially in the modern world. And I really believe that the story of the Latter-day Saints not only narrates that tension, but came to exemplify that tension itself. I hope this video was useful. If you haven't read the book, you might find it useful, although there have been some 1-volume histories written since then that are more up to date, including Mine American Zion, but I also strongly recommend Matthew Bowman's The Mormon People, which is also a great 1-volume history. I've done several videos at this point on Leonard Arrington's history division in the 1970s because it is such a crucial moment for modern Mormonism. Let me know if there are topics or issues related to that you want to see future videos on as well. If you haven't yet, you can subscribe to this channel. You can become a member if you want to give back. And if you found this video useful, share it with others so we can broaden this conversation. History has never been more relevant than it is today because it allows us to dig into these stories, like the story of the Latter-day Saints, which remains all the more important in framing the world we still live in today.